since you mentioned combining two rope lengths, what's your favorite knot?
Oh my God.
Were you going to ask
I was
that?
going to ask that same question, but I was saving it for the end.
Oh, sorry.
I literally have it written down here. That's so funny.
Sorry, I just thought, you mentioned combining two ropes.
Dude, we've been doing this for so long.
We always think about the same.
That we're morphing into the same person, I guess.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, you know what's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially like this year, just sort of like something on my mind.
Could be anything.
Well, probably on everyone's mind, actually. It's not just me. It's just like the extraordinary amount of rope it must have taken for whaling expeditions in the mid-19th century as depicted in a story such as Moby Dick and others. Like, just think about how much rope that required.
Is this whole episode an excuse for you to talk about Moby Dick?
It's not, but it is true.
But it is.
No, it's genuinely not.
One thing I learned, actually, in the course of researching this particular topic, which happens to be rope, the whale that apparently inspired Moby Dick was called Mocha Dick.
Yeah.
And also Dick was basically, like saying Joe back then.
Yeah.
Every Tom, Dick, and Harry, right? You hear that. So really, the Moby Dick whale was Mocha Joe.
Oh, that's right. It's funny. When I used to go to a coffee shop in Brattleboro, Vermont named Mocha Joe's.
Did it have a whaling theme?
It didn't, but that's I like
missed opportunity.
I like the way you did that. Apparently, from what I understand, I also at one point went down this, like, where did this name come from? I think Dick is in Moby Dick. Even then carried the sort of contemporary connotations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was like sort of like tough.
He was a jerk whale?
No, like sort of like masculine.
Oh,
like
I see.
Like even that he was sort of like that. It even back then sort of was this sort of that was a masculine name for reasons that one would associate it.
I'm not going to say anything else.
That's fine. Anyway, but it's interesting to think. We do these. You think about the history of technologies, etc. We did an episode on the history of nails and how crucial that was to the economy. And you think, like, here is this one technological breakthrough, some like unlock, and then it opens up all of these kinds of things. So whales were very important for like whale oil and candles, etc. But like, what were the technologies that preceded whaling? And you literally could not do it. And of course, that's just one example. But there are all kinds of technologies, things that you do that are economically productive. I remember in school, we learned about like simple machines, like the pulley and stuff like that. But you can't have a pulley without rope.
That's true.
No, for real. Like we learned about the pulley when I was in elementary school, but no one bothered mentioning when I was in elementary school that the pulley would have been a useless technology without rope to pull.
That the rope itself is the technology behind the technology. Yeah. This one's an interesting one because I think when you say the word rope, people think of something, old-fashioned. Yeah. Like rope is Lindy, just a bundle of cords, right? But actually, as we are about to discuss, there have been lots of technological breakthroughs in both the way rope is made and also the way rope is designed.
Totally. Well, I'm very excited to say we do, in fact, have the perfect guest, someone I've wanted to speak to for since last summer, I think, when I came across his work. We're going to be speaking with Tim Queeney. He is the author of the recent book, Rope, How a Bundle of Twisted Fibers Became the Backbone of Civilization. Quite a bold claim there, Tim.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's a bold claim, but, that's the whole why you have to buy the book and read it. It back it up.
What is rope? No, seriously, what makes something rope?
Well, that's a good question, and you can. People have asked me how you define rope, but for this book, I defined rope in a very broad sense, from everything down from cordage, which is thin, small rope or twine, or what you want to call it that, up to heavy-duty wire rope. So made of metal. So that it's all rope as far as I'm concerned, and that's sort of how I went in. But basically, rope is twisted fibers that are then used to accomplish work.
I definitely want to talk about space rope later on, or space elevators, because that's something I was completely unaware of. But before we do, just on the book itself, so I'm aware that these single topic books have become something of a phenomenon. So you have people explaining the history of human development through the medium of salt or the container box or fish, cod or whatever. But what does rope actually say about civilization or human development that other single object stories maybe miss?
Well, of course, rope, as we've already just talked about, is made up of fibers, or there's little strands of fiber. And if you want to talk about it in sort of a thematic way, rope is each one of those individual fibers can't do much on its own, but if you twist them all together, now you have a tool that's immensely useful. And it's sort of like the way a single person can't do all that much on their own, but people working together in groups can accomplish great things, and they often accomplish those great things down through history using rope.
So what is it about fiber? So you twist them together. I mean, this is going to sound dumb, but I really never thought about it before, even paid attention. But what is it about the property of a strand, the property of a fiber, or even the property of a long metal rod, such that when you twist them together, it becomes very load-bearing?
It's a combination of friction. Mm-hmm. Especially with fibers, it's a combination of friction, twist, and something you could call the helix effect. The friction, of course, is just the individual fibers as they're twisted together. They're rubbing up against each other and engaging all the little nooks and crannies of the fiber, or engaging with other nooks and crannies on other fibers. And so there's that friction that's stopping it, and a certain amount of sort of physical locking in that's going on, that's stopping them from sliding past each other. But then you twist it, and by twisting them, you're re-engaging those fibers in a new way, and even more deeply. And then finally, and we can go into more about rope twist and how that works. But finally, the last thing is what you might call the helix effect, which is if you were to take a rope and to wrap it around your arm.
For listeners, you should go over to the YouTube, because Tim is actually wrapping a rope around his arm. It looks a little bit like a tefillin, but yeah. Tell us what's going on here especially for those who are just listening.
So I'm just wrapping this rope around my arm, and I'm not actually. It's hard to maybe.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
I'm not actually nailing this to my arm or gluing it to my arm or riveting it to my arm, but I'm just putting it on my arm. And then, if you can't see maybe too well here, but if I pull it on the same axis on which I've wrapped it around my arm, it stays. I've literally done nothing to make this rope stay, other than the fact that it's all wrapped around my arm. So what's actually happening here is you have this helix of rope that when you pull on it on that same axis on which it was twisted, the helix collapses. And you might remember those party toys you got when you were a kid, where you stick your fingers in both ends and pull on them, and the so-called finger trap. And what happens is those toys are made up of a whole series of helixes, and when you pull on them, all the helixes collapse and they tighten up. And that's what happens with rope, with multiple strand rope. This rope I have right here is actually made of jute, and that's a natural fiber. And this is actually a 4-strand rope. I don't know if you can see the 4 strands here.
Listeners got to watch this on YouTube. This is so much better as a video than just audio, because you can see all the jute. All right.
The 4 strands, those strands, and most rope all through history has been 3-strand rope. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. But the strands, and when you pull on them, the strands all do that helix effect. The one strand is wrapped around the other 3 strands, and it's collapsing down on the other 3, and so on, with all 4 strands. They're all collapsing around each other. And that's what makes it incredibly strong, is this helix effect. And that was actually told to me by a German engineer who works in the industry, and he's so well known that he's called the Pope of Rope. And,
are there rope celebrities?
We should have had him on instead.
yeah, he's the real celebrity. But he told me about this helix effect, and so it's really those 3 things: the friction, the twisting, and then the helix effect that causes 3-strand rope to work so well. And 3-strand, of course, is most commonly made because it's the least number of strands you can use to have this helix effect. So it's sort of the most economical way to get the helix effect at its maximum without having to add more strands, which of course can add cost. So 3-strand is the way to go.
So we're talking about the basic design of rope. Walk us through, I guess, the technological breakthroughs when it comes to designing rope. Was there a moment, when the fourth cord was added or I don't know, they were twisted in a different way where someone was like, aha, I have invented the better rope that will now allow us to accomplish some great thing?
Well, that's really good question that I can't answer. And the reason why we can't answer that is because rope is such an ancient human tool that we just don't know when the first multi-strand rope was developed and made. The oldest rope that's ever been found is 50,000 years old, and that's a piece of cordage that was found on the bottom of a flint flake in a cave in southeastern France, and it was twisted by a Neanderthal person 50,000 years ago. There may be indeed have been rope much older than that was manufactured. But the problem with rope, natural fiber rope, is that it's made of plant material, and it tends to rot away. So there may be 70,000-year-old rope that was made, but we don't know.
One thing that really struck me, and you said this in your book, but these days you invent a new technology, it feels like, in a year later, it's obsolete, right? And the pace seems to be accelerating. And one thing that I really appreciated from your book is that in the old days, once a new technological innovation would come around, maybe once every couple 100,000 years or a million. I think you make the point that Homo erectus, who I guess were our uncles or something like that, basically had one invention, the hand axe. In 1.5 million years, they basically figured out one thing. Technological revolutions were pretty slow back in the old days.
Yeah, that's right. The hand axe, which, from what I understand, the people I've talked to, they're still archaeologists still aren't completely sure what those things were used for. There were so many of those around, and they were used for such a long time. And it's quite possible that in my book, I talk about the hand axe and stone tools happening before rope, but it's quite possible that they were around contemporaneously with rope, but we have that issue of them rotting away. But once you've developed this multi-strand rope, it now has all these great uses that can be put to. Probably the biggest use for early peoples was just the ability to organize your stuff. You can tie things together in bundles, which sounds maybe a little simplistic for us, but we do the same thing in lots of other ways. We just keep our stuff organized, and they had to do the same thing. And so rope was just a great a tool for that, in addition to using it for domesticated animals and being able to keep them in place so they don't run off, and lots of other things.
If I could fast forward about 50,000 years or so, Joe started this conversation talking about the importance of rope when it comes to whaling. And if you think about a time period like the 1800s, sort of marked by the expansion of the British Empire, lots of ships sailing around, all covered in rope in one way or another.
Lots of ships sailing around. That's a good description of much of all history.
I guess that's true. All right, but you know the kind of ships I mean. How important was being able to manufacture rope at a sort of industrial scale in the 1800s? Because, we're talking about a lot of rope. I think you have a stat in your book about how much rope it took just to, get a whale, and it was a lot.
Yeah, the whaling ships would carry more than 10,000 feet of rope just for use on board the whale boats that went out to actually hunt the whales, not even discussing all the other uses that rope is put to on a sailing ship. And as you point out, a sailing ship, which was the premier technology for hundreds of years for crossing oceans, is absolutely dependent upon rope, both for the standing rigging, which holds the masts up, and the running rigging, which controls the sails. Going all the way back to the Egyptians, they had the exact same issue. They had to have rope to keep their boats under control and for them to keep the masts from falling down. And if I could just go back for a second
Please.
To the Egyptians, very interestingly different way of building ships than the way a ship was built for example, for a whaling ship in the 19th century, the sort of the way of building ships in the Western world is to you build you put down a keel, then you have ribs that are 90 degrees to that keel, and then you have planks which cover the ribs, and now you have your hull. But the Egyptians actually did it in a completely different way, and other cultures as well. It wasn't just the Egyptians. They actually stitched their boats together. They took the planks and they cut these V-shaped grooves in the planks, and they actually threaded rope through these V-shaped grooves, and to either end of the collection of planks, and then tightened them up, and then they had a hull, and they would put ribs in after they had stitched these boats together, but the ribs were there just as in addition to the rope to hold the planks together. So rope is absolutely essential for a boat even to float. So that's pretty amazing. And as I said, it wasn't just the Egyptians, but also a lot of Arab boat building was done in a similar fashion with stitched boats. But going back to the era of the age of sail, they needed just tens of thousands of feet of rope to equip these vessels. And as you point out, the when you have that much rope required, it ceases to be a cottage industry, and the whole process becomes industrialized. And the people who really kicked this off were the British with their need to keep their large Royal Navy establishment going at all times and keep all these ships, that hundreds of ships available to go to sea. So they had a series of dockyards where they manufactured rope, and along with other things. And some maritime historians say that it really was the Royal Navy that kicked off the Industrial Revolution, because the whole process really needed to be industrialized to make all this rope.
Let's talk more about that. Tracy, I jokingly said, "Oh, ships floating around," but no, this is really a key point here, which is that it is, and to the definition of the book, how rope became the backbone of civilization. It is hard to imagine civilization without a lot of boats, and it is literally impossible to imagine sailboats of various sizes without ropes of various things. Was there in steel, they talk about like the Bessemer process. Suddenly, like some sort of unlock for steel existed before the Bessemer process, but then that unlocked a significant expansion. Was there some breakthrough that allowed for rope to go from one of these things that, let's twist some plant fibers with our hands and maybe wrap them around something, to something that could be truly produced at industrial scale?
I don't think that there's any one event like that. It was kind of a continuous process, much like rope itself, that went from rope being made outdoors in these rope yards where they would twist the rope in, because you need a lot of space to do all this twisting, to an indoor activity, because they no longer could take the time off for when it snowed and rained. You needed to make rope every day to meet the needs, as I said, of something like the Royal Navy. You needed to really produce rope on a massive scale, and the needs of something like a large sailing ship, where you need to have some very long ropes, specifically the longest rope being the anchor rod, or the rope that you tie your anchor to so you can anchor in deep water. That had to be 742 feet long, and so in order to make a 742 foot long, in the last part of the process of making rope, when you're putting the strands together, the rope actually gets shorter because you're twisting it, and the whole process, it gets shorter. But you have to start out with 1,000-foot long strands that you're twisting together to make the final rope that ends up being the 740 feet long. So you need a huge building to do this. And so these rope walks that were built in the various dockyards and around the world, it wasn't just the British who were doing this. They were built in the U.S. and all maritime nations were doing this, and even non-maritime nations, because you needed rope for other things. But these dockyards, these rope walks, really were the thing that industrialized the process and allowed you to make very long, very big ropes.
Can you talk to us on that note about the supply chain that created rope. So I guess rope in the 1800s was made out of jute or hemp or something like that. Where did that material come from, and how did it get to the dockyards in a place like London?
Yeah, that's a great question because it actually was a strategic material. There was something called naval stores. The British called them naval stores, which was pitch from pine to use for waterproofing, and then the actual pine trees themselves, the trunks to use for masts, and then finally the hemp that was used to make rope, because most of the rope made during the Age of Sail was made from hemp fibers, because it actually makes spectacularly good rope, because you can grow these hemp plants very, very tall, and the fibers that you can strip out of them are very long. And the longer the fiber, the better for the rope, the stronger the rope is. So these were strategic materials that the Royal Navy, for example, was always looking towards its supply of these materials. When the U.S. was a colony of Great Britain, the Parliament actually passed a law that required or asked or prompted American farmers to grow hemp plants so the hemp fiber could be sent back to Britain for use in making rope. Really the largest supplier of hemp was actually from Russia, from Ukraine, the area of the Ukraine, and that's where Britain got most of its hemp from. And amazingly, one of the reasons why Napoleon, for example, invaded Russia in 1812 was there were a number of reasons, but one reason was to cut off the hemp supply to the British Royal Navy, so then he could finally get around to invading Britain, which he failed to do.
It's interesting they made the colonists send back the hemp fiber back to Britain, preserving the value at, the poor colonists just had to ship raw commodities while the rope yards in Britain got to actually do the premium higher end value add. Very common pattern in history. Talk us a little bit more, about, so obviously when in a whaling expedition, there's the sail, right? And then there's apparently in Moby Dick, they talk about, although apparently he doesn't use the term, like they called it the Nantucket sleigh ride, after you get the hook in the whale and then the whales drag your boats. And then you're like wetting, someone has to pour water on the rope so that it's not burning their hands. Talk to us about like how big of a breakthrough that was in terms of acquiring this very important fuel.
Yeah. The whalers, of course, whaling started out with just attacking whales from the shore, but as those whales were used up, these whaling ships had to go farther and farther afield to find whales to harvest, and the rope was absolutely essential. The rope had to hold after they sunk in that harpoon, and the famous Nantucket sleigh ride when the whales going along the surface and dragging the boat behind it. The one that's really dangerous, though, is if the whale decides to sound or dive.
Right.
Because then the boat has to make sure that they have enough rope on board to let out enough rope so that they're not dragged underwater. And sometimes whale boats that were following a big whale, the other whale boats would get near them and they would actually combine two lengths of rope that they each had in their tubs, rope tubs, so that just to prevent the whale from sounding and actually dragging the boat under.
Since you mentioned combining two rope lengths, what's your favorite knot?
Oh my God!
Were you going to ask
I was going to ask that same question, but I was saving it for the end.
Oh, sorry.
I literally have it written down here. That's so funny.
Sorry, I just thought you mentioned combining two ropes.
Dude, we've been doing this for so long.
We always think about the same.
That we're morphing into the same person, I guess.
But let's just do it. What's your favorite knot?
Well, actually, but it's interestingly enough, my editor wanted to put a knot on the cover initially, but we realized
Tracy just showed me on her computer. She really did write down word for word. She was going to ask, "What's your favorite knot?" But I gazumped her. I asked it in the middle, even though she was saving it for the end. So This is for both
Well,
of
we
us.
we were going to put a knot on the idea came up to put a knot on the cover, but I said that this is actually not a knot book because I can't I can't actually take credit for being a knot expert. I'm
All
not
right, but you
really
must
a
have
knot
one. Let's
expert.
go.
But I do have a number of good knots that I like, and the one that's sort of the most fun to tie is the flying bowline, the bowline that forms in midair. But it's also called a tugboat bowline. It's great. It's a very useful knot to make at the last minute if you need to make a bowline or a loop at the end of a rope. You can actually make it very quickly, and then you can throw it around a bollard or something if you're on a tugboat and maybe save the boat. I don't know, but yeah, that's a fun one to show off. I don't know if I can do it here in this close space. I do need a bit of space.
Wait,
to
no,
do it,
make the
but-
knot.
Yeah, let's see. While you're doing it, Tracy, do you have a favorite knot?
No.
I do.
Like, I'm proud that I can tie my shoes. That's
I am. I can't tie my shoes, but you know what my favorite knot is? Someone showed a monkey's fist. Do you know that one?
No.
Do you know what a monkey's fist is, Tim?
Oh, sure, absolutely. That's for throwing line.
Yeah, you can like make this ball at the end of the rope, and then you can like put it through a loop, and it won't like go through. And it's very hard to. It's
What would you use that for?
Well, if you wanted to like put it, if you're pulling on something and you wanted to like put it through a loop, and you didn't want the rope to slide through a loop, like you want to
Right.
get to the end, so you could make sure it's there. Also, it's basically impossible to untie, from what in my experience. Tim is currently. Okay, let's
see if
see.
this works. I usually need even more space than this, but
Okay, let's see.
Ooh.
let's see if we can get this to work. Oh, no.
Try one more
No,
time.
it didn't work. Well, that's it right there.
Oh, there you go.
That's,
Hey,
that's even though I tied my microphone cord. It's through my microphone cord.
Too much for
oh
it.
yeah.
Actually,
anyway.
that's a nice seg into the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is rope in different materials. So we talked a little bit about, maybe there was breakthrough in terms of design and the way you're twisting cords. We don't really know because it was all organic material and it's decayed. But we do know that rope kind of leapt from jute, natural fibers, to metals, to steel and things like that. Talk to us about how important that was when it comes to, I guess, technological advancement in rope.
Yeah, there was a German engineer in the Harz Mountains, in the mining region of the Harz Mountains, this fellow named William Albert, and he realized and knew that a lot of the rope that they were using to haul materials up through mines, up through the shafts of mines, was corroding and breaking the natural fiber rope, and they would also use chains. But the problem with the chain is that when one link corrodes and breaks, the entire chain fails and the material falls. But he thought, what if I actually used iron, and I used strips of iron, lengths of iron, and I twisted it together, just like it was as if it was hemp, into multi-stranded rope. And he did that, and it worked spectacularly. And one of the reasons why it works is because even if you lose one strand, if one strand breaks, the entire rope doesn't fail. It has a very easy failure mode where it takes multiple strands to break for the wire rope to fail. So it was very useful in that industrial setting. And there was another German engineer who emigrated to the U.S., and his name was John Roebling, and he actually read. There's actually a piece that William Albert wrote in a journal, an industrial journal, that John Roebling read and became very interested in making his own wire rope, which he started doing, and his wire rope was superior, and in the 1840s. And he started a business of making wire rope, and then he got into designing suspension bridges. And of course, he and his son Washington Roebling were responsible for the Brooklyn Bridge, all made up with wire rope.
Yeah, that's wild. Like honestly, it wasn't until I read your book that it like dawned on me, like That's rope. That's the same thing. I mean, granted, the material is different, but that fundamental idea of the strength through coil or the strength through twisting is this that gave us the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, that's right.
You end your book with like the future of rope, so to speak, and the idea like maybe rope could one day give us an elevator into space.
Space rope.
Yeah, can you explain what that's all about?
Space elevator, yeah, it's great. Whenever I give a talk, I always ask, how many people here have ever heard of a space elevator? And never more than a quarter of them raise their hands. It's actually, I'm surprised. I thought more people knew about it, but it's actually a physics idea that goes back to the 19th century. The idea being that the Earth rotates at any point on the equator of the Earth is moving at 900 miles an hour. So if you were to attach something to the Earth and attach a tether to the Earth, and then you would extend that tether out into space with a weight on the end, 100,000 kilometers out, then what would happen would be, of course, it'd be the same as if you took a piece of rope like this and I attached a rock on the end of the rope and I twirled around in a circle. What would happen to the rope? The rope would go really tight as it was preventing that rock from flying away. So the exact same effect happens here. As the Earth rotates, the weight way out in space wants to fly off into the distance, and the tether's preventing it from doing that. And in the process, that tether becomes bar tight as it was made of steel. And once you have that, you can then put a crawler that uses friction wheels on that tether, and it can crawl up that tether up to say 23,000 miles high, which is a geosynchronous orbit, and you open the doors to your crawler and push the satellite out, a satellite you may have on board, push it out, and at 23,000 miles high, it's now in geosynchronous orbit. So you can put things into orbit without using rockets. You could also use this device to send that crawler all the way to the end of the tether at 100,000 kilometers out, and that tether, the end of that tether, is whipping around at very high speed because it has to keep up with. It has to describe a much larger circle than the circle of the equator. So it's moving very fast. 17,000 miles an hour. You can bring something up to the top of that, and if you want to send something to the moon, as the tether swings around when it hits the right angle, you release it, and it goes flying toward the moon without any need for rocketry. So it's an amazing device that up to now hasn't been built because of the one limiting factor, which is how do you build a tether that's strong enough to do the job?
Oh yeah, this was going to be my next question, which is you actually in the book seem quite bullish on the space elevator idea. And if you go and look up photos of it, it looks very sci-fi, right? It looks kind of out there, but realistically, do you think this is going to happen like sometime in our lifetimes?
Well, I did speak with two gentlemen who are very bullish about this. One, a guy named Pete Swan, who's a former NASA rocket scientist, and he was at one point the head of the International Space Elevator Consortium. I don't know if you knew there was such a thing.
A consortium for everything, huh?
Yes, and so he, and then a fellow named Adrian Nixon, who is associated with the University of Manchester in England, and they are both very bullish about this idea that it can be done and that it will be done soon. In fact, Pete Swan just left his position with the International Space Elevator Consortium, and he's starting up a company, and he said, we're going to go out and build this sucker. Huh. And the reason why it can do this, if I could just go on for a second, is there's this material called graphene, and it's a very strange material, and the way it's made is very strange. But it's it's basically carbon that's uses gaseous depositation onto a copper substrate, and when the conditions are right, it actually forms these hexagonal rings. They're all interconnected, and those interconnected hexagonal rings use the strongest bond known in nature, but that's only one atom one atom layer thick. Then you do it again, deposit it again, and another layer forms, and then another and another, and you can go to 26,000 layers, as Adrian Nixon told me about. And this tether is incredibly strong. I mean, it's unbelievably strong. You need something that's capable of 90 gigapascals of strength, tensile strength, to do this. And this graphene has been tested up to 120 gigapascals of strength. So it's very much capable of doing the job. The biggest drawback is that you have to have, it's a manufacturing drawback. You have to be able to make a tether 100,000 miles long with no brakes. So that's a little bit of a challenge.
You know, Tracy, like when I think about the fact that human or Homo erectus went 1.5 million years just like making the hand axe, and then you hear this, and it's like whether it happens in our lifetime, our kids' lifetime, their kids' lifetime, that's nothing. Like in the grand scheme of history, like which lifetime in the next couple hundred years it happens in is like truly an irrelevant.
Matters to me. I want to see the
I know, I want to see it too, but for our species, it's truly an irrelevant rounding error, exactly. And I do think, if rope is so crucial to all of these breakthroughs in civilization, being able to sail the seas, then naturally it probably is going to be an important technology for getting to other planets and so forth. Tim Queeney, thank you so much for coming on Odd Law. It's fascinating conversation. I am now convinced by your book's title that rope is the backbone of civilization.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
Tracy, that last point at the end, I have been thinking about this a lot, that like, we're just getting started here. We're like, we're 50,000 years of just making the most rudimentary rope out of twine, etc. And now we find like the humans being able to produce rope at industrial scale. It's like less than a minute in Earth time. You know what I'm saying? Like we're just getting started. And honestly, the idea that maybe in the next 1,000 years, which is also nothing, by the way, that we might get into space with rope, it seems very plausible to me.
Can I just say I got distracted because I searched for graphene.
Oh, yeah?
And someone's making graphene design earrings. They have the little like hexagonal stamp on them. It's kind of cool. No, not actually made out of graphene. But,
like the earrings, the design of the graphene.
The interlocking hexagons that Tim was talking about. No, there is something about rope where, we said this in the intro, but it's old, it's lindy, but on the other hand, it's continuously being like perfected and applied to different uses, right?
That core intuition, which Tim nicely demonstrated, which I had not thought about before, but that core intuition, you wrap it around something. You take one strand and then you pull a cord in the direction perpendicular or whatever with the direction of the thing, and it doesn't move. It's really powerful, right? It's really simple, but it's also really powerful. And the idea that then, okay, the game is then to get even more advanced materials. So you move past jute, you get to something synthetic, you go to steel, and then maybe to graphene. But that core simple fact that when you twist something around something, it becomes very durable is a pretty powerful conceptual unlock.
Well, also it avoids the single point of failure problem that you see in something like a chain. Yeah. But here's a question.
Okay.
If rope is the backbone of civilization and cords are the backbone of rope, then are cords the backbone of civilization? Like how far can you take this?
This is the thing, which is, and we just have to be humble. It's like civilization has many aunts and uncles. You know what I'm saying? Many fathers and mothers.
The string episode coming up soon.
No, but you're totally right, because like I could argue it's like, oh, whales are the whale oil, but you couldn't get there without the whatever it is. Like all of these things have various antecedents and then unlocks, right? And so it's always sort of helpful to understand. I like these history of technology things. It makes me appreciate everything a little bit more.
Yeah, and I guess how iterative a lot of it tends to be.
There was in the book he talks about what was the movie with Tom Hanks and he's like on an island and he has to
Castaway.
Yeah, and I guess he had to make some rope. I forgot. It's been a long time since I saw that movie. I feel like if I were on an island, that wouldn't occur to me. I wouldn't.
But you'd have a lot of time to think about it, Joe.
I bet I would never get there. I could do not. Oh, I should have twisted the fiber to make the boat. I'd be like, How do you do? I bet like that wouldn't have. Now, having read the book, of course, that's different. But had I not read the book, I think I would have been pretty screwed.
I guess Robinson Crusoe has to be like your next big read or something.
I should read that.
Yeah. All right. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Thoughts podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Check out Tim's book, Rope: How a Bundle of Twisted Fibers Became the Backbone of Civilization. And follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Kel Brooks at Kel Brooks.
And for more Odd Thoughts content, you should check out our daily newsletter. You can find that at bloomberg.com/Odd Thoughts.
And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 with fellow listeners in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation about rope, then please leave a comment or like the video, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.